Out. The pocket watch sat in a cardboard box at the end of a folding table, between a cracked ceramic rooster and a stack of water-damaged Reader's Digest condensed books from the 1970s. It had no display case, no velvet, no small printed card explaining what it was. The tag rubber banded to the box read $15, everything in box, and the box also contained 2 broken ballpoint pens, a jar of old buttons, and a travel-size bottle of hand lotion that had turned the consistency of wet cement. Out. Nobody had stopped at that table in the 40 minutes that Martin Hale had been standing near it. Out. He was not supposed to be there at all. The estate sale at the Whitmore property in Concord, New Hampshire, was the kind of event that Aldrich Premier Estates ran for old New England families with the particular combination of accumulated wealth and generational entropy that produced attics full of things nobody had looked at in 30 years. Out. Richard Aldrich, who had built Aldrich Premier into the most prominent estate liquidation firm in the Northeast, moved through the main rooms of the house with the practiced efficiency of someone who had already decided which items mattered and had arranged the rest in descending order of indifference. The good pieces were in the front parlor under proper lighting. The silver, the oils, the Federal period furniture. Out. Everything else radiated outward from there in concentric rings of diminishing significance, ending here, in the side room off the back hallway, where the folding tables held the things that Aldrich's team had categorized as fill. Out. Martin was 47 years old. He ran a watch repair shop in a narrow storefront in Nashua, 17 miles south, in a building that had previously been a shoe repair shop and before that a locksmith, and still smelled faintly of leather and machine oil, which Martin had never tried to fix because he thought it suited the place. Out. He had driven up that morning in his Subaru with a thermos of coffee and a jeweler's loop in his jacket pocket, because estate sales in old New England houses occasionally produced things worth the drive, and because his son Noah had a soccer game that afternoon and Martin had promised to be back by 2. Out. He had been working through the side room methodically, the way his father had taught him, starting at the far end and moving toward the door so he didn't miss anything by circling back. He was 3 tables from the end when he saw the cardboard box. Out. He almost kept walking. Out. The rooster was genuinely ugly. The Reader's Digests were genuinely ruined. But there was a shape in the lower left corner of the box, half covered by a loose flap of cardboard, that caught his eye the way a wrong note catches a musician's ear. Not loudly, not dramatically, just distinctly wrong for the context. Out. Martin set down his coffee thermos, reached into the box and lifted the pocket watch out, with 2 fingers around the case edge, the way you handle something before you know what it is. Out. He turned it over. Out. The case was gold-filled, not sauced gold, heavily tarnished, the surface pitted along the back edge in a pattern consistent with decades of humidity. The bow, the small loop at the top where a chain would attach, was slightly bent, the kind of deformation that happened gradually from the weight of a chain being removed and replaced thousands of times. The crystal was cracked along one edge. Out. The dial was cream-colored enamel with black Roman numerals, and the name printed below the 12 in a small, precise serif font was not a name Martin recognized immediately. Out. Haverford & Sons, Philadelphia, Est, 1881. Out. He turned it back over and looked at the case back. No engraving on the outer surface, which told him nothing. He applied light pressure to the release catch with his thumbnail and the back opened. Out. The movement inside was not what the exterior had suggested. Out. Martin did not make a sound. He stood at the folding table in the back room of the Whitmore estate with the watch open in his palm and looked at what was inside with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has just heard something in a language they know well and needs to make sure they heard it correctly. Out. The movement was 17 joules, lever escapement adjusted to 5 positions. The finishing on the plates was not the machine-brushed standard of factory production. It was hand-finished. Specifically, the beveling on the plate edges had been done by hand with a tool pulled at a consistent angle that left a distinctive chamfer visible only under magnification. Martin did not have his loop out yet. Out. He could see it without the loop, because his father had made him look at enough movements that the pattern was part of how his eyes processed information. Out. Behind him, near the doorway, he heard footsteps stop. Out. That box is $15. The voice belonged to a young woman with an Aldrich Premier lanyard and a clipboard, speaking with the brisk neutrality of someone managing 15 things simultaneously. Out. I know, Martin said, without looking up. I'm still looking. Out. She moved on. Out. Martin closed the case back carefully, put the watch in his jacket pocket, picked up his thermos, and walked to the cashier table near the front entrance. He paid $15 in cash, received a handwritten receipt, and went to his car. Out. He sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes without starting the engine. Out. Then he took the watch out of his pocket and looked at the movement again, this time with the loop. Out. The serial number was stamped on the pillar plate. 7 digits, beginning with 4. Martin knew serial number ranges the way some people know zip codes, by feel, by context, by the sense of something landing in a familiar category. The 4 prefix range for Haverford movements dated to a specific manufacturing window. He would need to check the production ledgers to be certain, but if he was right about the range, this movement had been built sometime between 1893 and 1897. Out. Which meant it had been built during the years when Haverford and Sons had employed, as their master finisher, a craftsman named Edmund Pruitt. Out. Martin started the car. Out. He made it to Noah's soccer game with 11 minutes to spare, sat on the folding aluminum chair he kept in the trunk, and watched his son play the second half without checking his phone once, which was more than he could usually manage. Out. Noah was 9 with his mother's habit of absolute concentration, and he played soccer the way he did most things, with a seriousness that other children on the field hadn't developed yet, and a patience that occasionally read as hesitation until it suddenly didn't. Out. Noah's mother, Patricia, had died of an aggressive cancer diagnosis 14 months earlier, in a timeline so compressed from detection to absence that Martin still sometimes reached for his phone to call her before he remembered. He had taken Noah out of the after-school program and rearranged the shop hours to be home by 4 every day, because there are some adjustments a person makes that don't feel like decisions at the time. They feel like the only available shape of things. Out. After the game, Noah ate a grilled cheese at the kitchen counter while Martin went downstairs to the shop and set the watch on his bench under the proper magnification lamp. Out. The serial number confirmed the production window, 1895 to 1896 almost certainly. Out. Martin opened his laptop and went to the archive he had maintained for 11 years. A private database of Haverford production records hand-entered from microfilm copies of the original ledgers he had photographed during 3 separate research trips to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Out. His father, George Hale, had spent the last 20 years of his life compiling what he called the most complete private record of American railroad-grade watchmaking between 1880 and 1920, a category that most horological scholars treated as a footnote and George had treated as a life's work. Out. Martin filtered the archive by serial number range and movement specification. Out. The result was a single entry. Out. Serial number 4471882. Movement 17 jewel lever escapement 5 position adjusted hand-finished plates with double bevel chamfer. Finisher designation EP. The finisher designation EP appeared in Haverford's internal production records on exactly 23 movements produced over a 14-month period from late 1895 to early 1897, after which Edmund Pruitt had left the company. Circumstances unrecorded, destination unrecorded. Out. Of those 23 movements, 16 had been accounted for by his father's research. 5 were in private collections. 4 were in museum holdings. 7 had been sold at auction over the past 30 years, with the most recent realized price for a movement in significantly worse condition than this one being $94,000 at a specialist auction in 2019. Out. The remaining 7 movements were unaccounted for. Out. Martin looked at the serial number on the watch in front of him, 4471882. He checked it against his father's database 3 times. It was not in the accounted list. It was not in the unaccounted list. It was not in his father's database at all. Out. Which meant one of 2 things. Either this was a production record his father had missed, possible but unlikely given the obsessive thoroughness with which George Hale had worked, or this was a movement that had never been catalogued. A 24th example. One that Haverford's internal records might not even show if it had been built as a personal commission outside the standard production run. Out. Martin sat back on his shop stool and looked at the cracked crystal and the tarnished case and the $15 box it had come out of. Out. He picked up his phone and called the one person who would know. Out. Douglas Pruitt was 79 years old, semi-retired from 50 years of horological research and consulting, and the foremost living authority on American fine watchmaking of the Gilded Age period. He was also Edmund Pruitt's great-grandson, a fact he mentioned rarely, and which colored everything he knew about the subject with a quality that was neither objective nor sentimental, but something more complicated than either. Out. Martin had met him once at a symposium in Philadelphia 6 years ago and had been introduced by a mutual contact as George Hale's son. Douglas had shaken his hand with the particular attention of someone who had respected the father's work and was withholding judgment on the son. Out. They had corresponded twice by email since then, once when Martin found a Haverford gauge tool in an estate lot and wanted to verify its origin, and once when Douglas had sent Martin a scan of a document he thought George would have wanted to see, not knowing George had died the year before. Out. Martin sent a text message rather than calling. He described the movement in 3 sentences and attached 4 photographs. He included the serial number and the finisher designation. Out. He did not sleep well that night. He checked his phone at 11:30 and at 2 in the morning and found nothing. At 6:15, while he was making coffee and Noah was still asleep, the phone rang. Out. Where did you find it? Douglas Pruitt's voice was not asking a question. It was the voice of a man who had skipped the preliminary portion of a conversation because the preliminary portion no longer seemed relevant. Out. Estate sale in Concord, yesterday morning. Out. What condition is the movement? Out. Martin described it. Douglas was quiet for a long time. Out. The serial number you sent me does not appear in any record I have ever seen, Douglas said. My great-grandfather kept personal notes separately from the Haverford production logs, not complete notes. Fragments. I have 4 notebooks, about half of which are legible. He paused. In the 3rd notebook there is a single entry, undated, no context, that reads, Commission outside contract. 1 movement, personal specification, finest work I have done. Delivered to W.H. Out. March 1896, nothing else. Out. Martin set down his coffee cup. Out. W's, he said. Out. I have never been able to determine who W.H. was, Douglas said. I have looked for 40 years. The initials appear nowhere else in my great-grandfather's papers. Out. Martin looked across the kitchen toward the window. The March light was coming in flat and pale over the neighbor's roof. Out. The estate was the Whitmore property, he said. William Whitmore. Out. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Martin looked at the screen to see if the call was still connected. Out. Send me every photograph you have, Douglas said. I'll drive down tomorrow. Out. Douglas Pruitt arrived at the Nashua shop at 10 in the morning in a gray Volvo wagon carrying a leather satchel that had the patina of something used daily for 30 years. He came through the door, shook Martin's hand without extended preamble, and stood at the bench looking at the watch in its open case for almost a full minute before touching it. Out. He was a compact man with careful hands and the posture of someone who had spent decades bent over small objects and had learned to counteract that through deliberate effort. He set the satchel on the second stool and opened it, removing a portable magnification stand, a small adjustable lamp, and a manila folder that he placed to the side without opening immediately. Out. May I, he said, and when Martin nodded, he lifted the watch with 2 fingers, the same instinctive grip Martin had used at the estate table, and positioned it under the magnification stand. Out. He did not speak for 12 minutes. Martin knew this because he watched the clock above the parts cabinet, the same clock that had been on that wall when his father had run this shop, a Seth Thomas regulator that George Hale had repaired himself and rehung and wound every Sunday morning for 22 years. Out. When Douglas finally straightened, he opened the manila folder. Inside were 3 photocopied pages of handwritten notes, the ink faded to the brown-gray of old documents, the handwriting a dense compressed cursive that leaned slightly to the left. Out. My great-grandfather's 3rd notebook, Douglas said, the relevant pages. Out. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the 2nd page without touching the photocopy. Martin leaned in and read the compressed cursive slowly. Out. The notation read, Finished the plate edge to the 3rd bevel, not standard, not spec, my own variation. If anyone ever looks at this movement and knows what they are seeing, they will know it is mine. Out. Martin stood up from the bench. Out. The 3rd bevel, he said. Out. Standard chamfer on Haverford production movements is 2-pass, Douglas said. The movements my great-grandfather finished to standard specification show a consistent 2-pass bevel. The movement in front of us shows a 3-pass bevel on the plate edge. He paused. I have examined over 400 movements in my career that carried the EP finisher designation, attributed or confirmed. I have never seen the 3-pass bevel on any of them. Out. Martin looked at the watch. Out. He put it here intentionally, he said, so it could be identified. Out. He was a careful man, Douglas said, and his voice had the quality of someone speaking about a person rather than a historical figure. He knew what he was making. He wanted it to be findable. Out. Noah came down the interior staircase at noon, still in his soccer socks from the morning, and stood in the doorway of the shop looking at the unfamiliar old man with the frank, assessing calm of a child who had learned that adults in his father's shop were usually there for a reason worth respecting. Out. This is Mr. Pruitt, Martin said. He's helping me with something. Out. Noah looked at the watch on the bench. Is that the old watch? Out. Yes. Out. Is it worth a lot? Out. Martin glanced at Douglas, who had the expression of someone successfully suppressing a smile. We're still figuring that out, Martin said. Out. Noah accepted this and went to the small refrigerator in the back of the shop for a juice box, then disappeared back upstairs. Out. Douglas watched him go with the expression of someone registering something. Out. How long has it been, he said, not a question exactly. Out 14 months, Martin said. Out. Douglas nodded once, the way people nod when they understand something they did not need explained. Out. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the authentication. Douglas had brought a set of reference photographs, his own archive, accumulated over decades, and he cross-referenced each detail of the movement against known Pruitt finished examples, dictating observations into a small recorder, and pausing occasionally to make handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad. Out. His method was slow and precise in the way that thoroughness always is, without ceremony, without display, just the accumulated application of knowing what to look for. Out. By 4 o'clock he had filled 6 pages of the legal pad. Out. I want to be careful about language, Douglas said when he set down his pen. I will not say this is definitively the commission piece without a matching production document. Out. What I will say is this. The movement characteristics, the serial number position within the Haverford sequence, the 3-pass bevel, and the personal notation in my great-grandfather's notebook together constitute the strongest evidentiary case I have encountered in 50 years of research for the identification of an unrecorded Pruitt commission piece. He looked at Martin. I will put that in writing. Out. Martin asked the question that needed asking. Out. Value? Out. Douglas was quiet for a moment. In the current specialized market, a confirmed Pruitt personal commission, not a standard EP production finishing but a documented commission with provenance, would be in a category I have never seen realized because nothing like this has ever come to market. He paused. The 2019 auction result you are familiar with was for a standard finished movement with no commission provenance. That brought $94,000. Another pause. Out. I would not be comfortable putting a ceiling on this. Out. He stayed for dinner because Noah asked him to, with the directness children deploy when they have decided they like someone, and because Douglas accepted with the brevity of a man not accustomed to being invited to things and not wanting to make more of it than it was. He ate the chicken and rice Martin made and talked to Noah about soccer with the careful interest of someone who knew nothing about soccer but was genuinely curious about the child explaining it. Out. After Noah was in bed, Martin called the main line for Aldrich Premier Estates. Out. Richard Aldrich did not take unsolicited calls in the evening. Martin left a message with the answering service. He described himself as the purchaser of a $15 box lot from the Whitmore estate sale and said he had information relevant to a significant valuation matter. He left his number and ended the call. Out. Richard Aldrich called back the next morning at 8:45. Out. Martin explained what he had found, what Douglas Pruitt had authenticated, and what he intended to do. He was not asking permission. The sale had been completed. The receipt was in his files. He was informing Aldrich out of professional courtesy, and because the authentication would become public record regardless. Out. The silence on Richard Aldrich's end was the silence of a man performing a rapid and unfavorable calculation. Out. That box was priced for clearance, Aldrich said finally. Our appraisers reviewed the room. Out. I understand, Martin said. The sale is complete and legally documented. I'll be proceeding with a dedicated auction through a specialist house. Out. Another silence. Which house? Out. I haven't decided yet. Out. This was not entirely true, but it was not the conversation for that information. Out. What happened next Martin had not anticipated, though in retrospect he recognized the shape of it as something he should have seen coming. The black Range Rover appeared outside the shop 2 days later, mid-morning, while Noah was at school. The man who came through the door was named Gerald Foss. Out. Martin knew the name from the trade. Foss was a regional dealer and broker who had spent 20 years moving specialty timepieces through a network of private buyers, and had the particular ease of a man who had operated for a long time in spaces where the written rules were treated as starting points. Out. Foss looked at the shop the way Richard Aldrich had probably briefed him to look at it, with the calibrated friendliness of someone who has come to offer a solution to a problem you didn't know you had. Out. You found something interesting in Concord, he said, not a question. Out. I bought a box lot, Martin said. Out. Right. Foss put a card on the counter. I represent a private buyer who's interested in acquiring it directly. No auction fees, no timeline, no public process. He named a number, $350,000, wire transfer within 48 hours. Out. Martin looked at the card without picking it up. Out. No, he said. Out. Foss smiled with the practiced patience of a man who had learned that the first no was rarely the final position. That's a strong offer for a piece with no established auction record. You'd be taking on real risk going to market. Out. I understand the risk, Martin said. Out. The authentication is one scholar's opinion. There are collectors who will want a second. Out. Douglas Pruitt has already agreed to appear at the auction as an expert witness, Martin said. The documentation is complete. Out. Foss recalibrated. The easy confidence shifted into something more considered. He looked around the shop again, the parts cabinet, the regulation clock, the framed photograph above the bench of a man Martin's age standing at a watchmaker's table in what appeared to be a different decade. And when he looked back at Martin, he had set aside the opening framework of the conversation and arrived at a more direct one. Out, 450,000, he said, final. Out. Martin came around the counter and opened the front door. Out. I'd like you to leave, he said, not raised, not performed. The statement of a man who had already ended the conversation internally and was waiting for the physical fact to catch up. Out. Foss left. He paused on the sidewalk outside and looked back through the window at the bench where the watch sat in its open case under the lamp, and his expression was the expression of a man deciding whether a situation was truly closed or whether it required another approach. Then he got in the Range Rover and drove away. Out. Martin stood at the window until the car was out of sight. Then he went to the phone and called Douglas. Out. Someone came to the shop, he said. Out. I expected they would, Douglas said. How much? Out. 450, final offer. Out. Douglas was quiet for a moment, then we should move quickly. Out. The auction was scheduled for a Thursday 3 weeks later, through a Boston specialist house that handled fine horological and scientific instruments and had the right client list for what this required. Douglas flew in from Philadelphia the night before and stayed at a hotel 2 blocks from the venue. Martin drove up that morning with Noah in the passenger seat because Noah had asked to come, and Martin had no good reason to say no, and several that weren't good enough. Out. Noah wore a button-down shirt he had selected himself and carried a small notebook he had recently decided to bring everywhere, for reasons he had not fully explained. He sat in the back of the room with an Aldrich Premier lanyard from his father's glove compartment that he had repurposed as something to fidget with, and watched the room fill with the particular attention of a child who understood that something was happening without needing it explained. Out. Gerald Foss was in the 3rd row. Martin noted this, said nothing, and took his position at the side of the room near the seller's representative desk. Out. Douglas sat in the front row with his leather satchel on the seat beside him and did not look at anyone when they came in. He looked at the watch, displayed on a small velvet stand on the presentation table at the front of the room, cleaned and recased with a new crystal but otherwise exactly as Martin had found it, every original surface intact. Douglas looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for 40 years. Out. The auctioneer opened to the bidding at $80,000. Out. 80 became 140 in the first 20 seconds, 2 phone bidders, and a man in the back corner raising his paddle with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided on his ceiling before he sat down. Out. 140 became 210, then 280. Gerald Foss raised his paddle at 300,000, with the expression of a man who had restructured his offer and was prepared for a different outcome than last time. The phone lines moved past him. 340. 390. Out. Foss at 410. Out. 450 from the phone. 480. Foss set his paddle on his knee. Out. $520,000. Out. The phone lines went quiet. Out. The auctioneer's voice steadied. 520,000 going once. Out. Martin was standing at the side wall. He had one hand in his jacket pocket where the jeweler's loop was, the way he always carried it, the habit of someone who spent his days looking at things closely. He was not looking at the front of the room. He was looking at Noah, who had stopped fidgeting with the lanyard and was watching his father's face with the complete, unguarded attention of a child reading a situation through the one person in the room he trusted absolutely. Out. Going twice. Out. Noah did not understand the number, but he understood his father's face. Out. The gavel came down. Out. Sold. $520,000. Out. The room moved. Voices, the particular percussion of phones being raised for photographs, a scattered applause that belonged more to the occasion than to anyone's enthusiasm. Gerald Foss stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out through the side exit at a pace that was not hurried and was also not slow, the gait of a man managing a public outcome with practiced composure. Out. Douglas remained seated. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and looked at the watch on the velvet stand with the expression of someone who has just witnessed a long account settle in a way they did not expect to see in their lifetime. When Martin came to the front of the room after the crowd had thinned, Douglas stood and shook his hand with both of his, holding it a moment before releasing. Out. My great-grandfather made that for William Whitmore in March of 1896, Douglas said. It sat in a cardboard box for how long, do you think? Out. Probably decades, Martin said. Out. And you saw it? Out. Martin thought about the cardboard box, the ceramic rooster, the water-damaged books, the particular shape that had caught his eye from 3 feet away before he had consciously registered what it was. Out. My father taught me what to look for, he said. Out. Douglas nodded. He picked up his leather satchel and his coat. At the door of the auction room, he turned back once and looked at Noah, who was still in his seat in the back row, writing something in his notebook with the concentrated seriousness he brought to most things. Out. Good kid, Douglas said. Out. He is, Martin said. Out. Douglas Pruitt drove back to Philadelphia that evening. Martin took Noah to a diner 2 blocks from the auction house, and Noah had a grilled cheese and a chocolate milkshake and told Martin about the notebook entry he had made during the auction, which was a description of the room and the sound the gavel made, because he had decided he wanted to remember it. Out. Martin listened to all of it. Out. He did not change the shop, he did not move, he did not hire anyone new that month or the next. He opened a college account for Noah at the credit union the following week, the kind with the long-time horizon and the compounding structure that a 9-year-old cannot fully appreciate yet, but that a father can arrange quietly and without announcement. Out. He kept the remainder in a business account and ordered a new magnification lamp for the bench, because the old one had been losing consistency on the left side for 2 months, and he had been meaning to replace it. Out. The Seth Thomas regulator on the wall above the parts cabinet he wound on Sunday morning, the way his father had wound it, without deciding to do so consciously, because some habits are not habits so much as a shape you have grown into and only notice when you try to imagine the absence of them. Out. Richard Aldrich sent a letter 2 weeks after the auction, written on Aldrich Premier letterhead in the formal, careful language of a man whose attorney had reviewed the phrasing. It acknowledged the sale, noted that the lot had been sold in good faith under the disclosed terms, and included in the final paragraph a sentence that had clearly been added after the formal language was finished, because it did not match the tone of the rest of the letter. Out. It said that Aldrich recognized the depth of knowledge that the identification had required, and that he would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss a future consulting arrangement if Martin was amenable. Out. Martin read the letter twice and put it in the filing cabinet under correspondence. Out. He did not respond that week. He thought about it, on and off, while working through the regular jobs on the bench, a grandmother's anniversary watch that needed a mainspring, a pocket watch from an estate in Manchester that turned out to be exactly what it appeared to be, and eventually decided that he was amenable, and that he would say so when it felt like the right time, and that it was not urgent. Out. Gerald Foss sent no letter. Martin had not expected one. Out. Douglas Pruitt sent a package in the mail 10 days after the auction, a photocopy of 2 pages from Edmund Pruitt's third notebook, the pages containing the commission entry and the note about the third bevel, along with a short handwritten note on plain paper. The note said, "For your records, and for your sons eventually." The watch found the right person to find it. D.P. Out. Martin pinned the photocopy to the board above his bench, next to a wiring schematic for a clock movement he was rebuilding and a photograph of his father standing in this same shop sometime in the early 1990s, one hand on the bench, looking at something out of frame with the focused, unhurried expression Martin recognized as the one he saw in his own reflection most mornings. Out. On a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the sale, Martin was at the bench with a movement apart in its components on the timing mat when Noah came down from upstairs and climbed onto the second stool and opened his notebook to a new page. Out. What are you doing? Noah asked, the way he asked every afternoon with the seriousness of someone for whom the answer would determine something. Out. Looking at a watch. Out. Is it special? Out. Martin turned the balance wheel over under the lamp, checking the hairspring for the particular kind of distortion that was invisible from the wrong angle. Out. I don't know yet, he said. I'm still looking. Out. Noah wrote something in the notebook. Martin did not ask what it was. Out. He turned back to the balance wheel, adjusted the angle of the lamp by 2 degrees, and looked again. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was dropping off the front of the building, and the street was doing the quiet thing it did between the end of school traffic and the beginning of the dinner hour, that particular stillness that settled over Nashua on weekday afternoons when there was nothing urgent happening anywhere in the visible world. Out. Martin looked at the movement in front of him with the patience his father had given him, the habit of looking at things other people had already decided weren't worth looking at, and he kept looking until the light changed. Out. I keep thinking about that cardboard box, the ceramic rooster, the water-damaged books, the $15 tag rubber-banded around something that turned out to be worth more than most people will earn in a decade, and the thing that stays with me isn't the number. It's the fact that the box had been sitting on that table for 40 minutes before Martin walked past it. Out. 40 minutes of people with clipboards and lanyards and professional opinions moving through that room, and not one of them stopped. Out. That's not bad luck. That's what happens when you stop looking at things carefully. When you decide before you're close enough to know that something isn't worth your time. Out. Martin stopped because his father taught him to stop. George Hale spent 20 years building a database that most people in his field considered an eccentric hobby. He drove to Philadelphia 3 times to photograph microfilm records of production ledgers that hadn't been consulted in decades. He did it because he believed that the things people overlooked were often overlooked for the wrong reasons, not because they had no value, but because nobody had done the work of understanding them. Out. That's a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates quietly, year after year, until one Tuesday morning it hands itself to your son in a cardboard box at an estate sale in Concord. Out. What Martin did with it required something different, not just the knowledge his father gave him, but the steadiness to trust it when everyone around him was operating from a different set of assumptions. Richard Aldrich had a staff. Gerald Foss had a Range Rover and a private buyer, and a number that would have changed most people's Tuesday. Out. Martin said no twice and meant it both times, not because he was stubborn, but because he had already done the math on what the watch actually was, and no one else's opinion of it was going to rearrange that. There's a kind of quiet courage in that, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that makes a speech, just the ability to hold your position when the pressure is coming from people who are used to getting what they ask for. Out. And then there's Noah in the back row with his notebook writing down the sound the gavel makes because he wants to remember it. 9 years old, one parent gone 14 months, sitting in a Boston auction house, in a button-down he picked himself, paying attention. Out. I think about what that boy is learning, not from a lesson, not from anything Martin sat him down to explain, but from watching his father crouch over a workbench at 6 in the evening and treat a broken mainspring with the same care he'd give something worth $500,000. You teach a child how to work by working. You teach them how to look by looking. Everything else follows from that. Out. The watch found Martin because Martin was the kind of person it could find. That's the whole story, really. Douglas Pruitt spent 40 years wondering about that single ledger entry, commission outside contract, one movement, finest work I have done, and the answer was sitting in a cardboard box between a cracked ceramic rooster and some ruined books, waiting for someone patient enough and prepared enough and honest enough to recognize it. Out. Most things worth finding are waiting the same way. They don't announce themselves, they just sit there, correctly priced at $15, until the right person walks by and stops.